They shoved me out onto the street in the middle of the night. It was freezing cold and raining, and I was holding my twin babies, who were only 10 days old. My husband just stood there, watching me freeze. His mother leaned in and spit right at me. They called me garbage and trash. What they didn't know, however, was this. Everything they owned, the house, the cars, the money, it all belonged to me. I was about to take it all back. Slowly, painfully. I am Haven, and this is the story of the worst lie I ever lived and the sweetest revenge I ever got. Before we start, write your name and where in the world you are watching from in the comments below. If people you loved ever lied to you or treated you like nothing, stick around, because what I did to them, they never saw it coming. Hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss how this all plays out. To understand what happened that night, we have to go back 4 years. Back then, my name was Catherine Monroe. I was the young CEO of a massive company called Apex Innovations. It was a technology business worth $8 billion. Yes, billion with a B. I built that fortune almost from scratch. My parents died and left me with a small, failing tech startup and a heavy mountain of debt. I was only 23 years old. I was mad at the world, totally focused and smart. In 5 years, I took that business that was almost dead and turned it into a global powerhouse. But all that success cost me something major. The first man I planned to marry tried to murder me for the money I inherited. He set up a car wreck. It was close, but I lived. But something inside me broke that day. It was my ability to trust anyone ever again. So when I met Ryan at a charity event, I decided I had to test him first. I created a totally fake life for myself. I became Haven. I made myself look like a regular woman who worked as a freelance graphic designer and didn't have much money. I used my late mother's last name for the business world. I kept my 2 lives completely separate. Only my lawyer and my assistant knew the real story. I desperately needed to know if any man could love the person I was, not the money I had. Ryan seemed great. He was charming, kind, and always paid attention to me. He worked in management at a tech company he thought was totally independent. What he didn't know was that my massive company secretly owned his company. It was hidden deep behind layers of corporate paperwork. I watched him for months before we even went on a date. He seemed genuine and good, so I finally let myself fall in love. We had a small, private wedding, but his family hated me right away. I could feel their coldness. His mother, Helen, barely managed to smile during the ceremony. His father, George, kept looking at me with these cold, judging eyes. His sister, Jessica, hugged me quickly. But then she leaned in close and whispered, "You better treat my brother right, or else." I should have listened to those warnings, but I didn't. I was stupid because I was in love. For the first year, everything was wonderful. Ryan was everything I dreamed of. We traveled. We laughed. We built a life together. I almost forgot I was living a massive lie. Almost. Then I got pregnant with twins. And suddenly, everything changed overnight. The way Helen reacted when I told her still sticks with me. Her face turned mean and ugly. She spat out the words, "2 more mouths to feed, you gold digger. You set this up, didn't you? You trapped my boy with babies." I stood there stunned, my hand covering my growing stomach. Ryan looked stressed and uncomfortable, but he didn't say a single thing to his mother. That was the first time I realized. The man I married was fundamentally weak, and that the family I had hoped to gain hated me. The doctor confirmed what I already knew. A twin pregnancy at my age, and with my history, was high risk. I needed strict rest and reduced stress. That diagnosis was the opening Helen had waited for. She showed up 2 days later with 3 suitcases and the declaration that she was moving in to help. The help was a prison sentence. Helen immediately evicted me from the master bedroom, claiming Ryan needed his space and that I should be closer to the ground floor in case of an emergency. The room she assigned me was the small guest room at the back of the house, above the laundry. It was cold, and the air always smelled faintly of bleach and mildew. The sheets felt perpetually damp against my skin, and the single window was sticky with condensation. I was too tired and nauseous to fight, and Ryan simply stood by, shrugging, muttering, "It's just easier, Haven." The psychological torture began instantly. She controlled the food. While Ryan and George ate hot, well-seasoned meals, steak, roasts, fresh vegetables, I was given cold plates of leftovers, always stored in plastic containers, half-eaten mashed potatoes, stale pieces of bread, the charred ends of whatever meat they had discarded. She would watch me eat in the kitchen, hovering, never speaking, but letting the silence thicken until the food caught in my throat. "You need to eat more, dear," she would finally say, her voice falsely sweet. "You're feeding 2 babies, after all. But don't expect special treatment. We're not made of money here." Every day, the physical abuse was disguised as necessary chores. Despite the doctor explicitly forbidding any heavy lifting, Helen constantly found tasks for me. "It's good for circulation, Haven. You can't just lay around like a lazy slug," she'd scoff. She forced me to hand-scrub the tile floor in the kitchen, a huge, agonizing job that left my back throbbing and my knees bruised. I would spend hours bent double, feeling sharp pains in my sides, the worry for the boys a cold pit in my stomach. She would assign me the laundry, heaping baskets of heavy, wet towels and sheets that I had to drag from the washer in the basement up 2 flights of stairs to the landing dryer. Each step was a risk, each load a searing reminder that I was disposable in this house. Ryan saw it all. He saw me struggling with the overflowing laundry baskets, my face pale and slick with sweat. He saw the plates of cold food I was forced to eat. He saw me sleeping under 3 scratchy blankets in the freezing guest room. But when his eyes met mine, he immediately looked away, focused on the television or his phone, shrinking into himself. His silence was not cowardice, it was acceptance. He was choosing his comfort over my safety and the health of our children. The maliciousness escalated when Jessica came to visit for the weekend. Jessica was all sharp angles and suppressed envy, and she looked at my pregnant belly with outright disgust. I was 8 months along, moving with the slow, difficult shuffle of a woman carrying 2 full-term children. I needed to go upstairs to retrieve the heating pad the doctor recommended. I was holding the wooden railing tightly, carefully pulling myself up the last few steps, concentrating on my breathing. Jessica came tearing around the corner from the upstairs landing, laughing loudly into her phone. She was running late, she announced dramatically, rushing to leave. She did not slow down. She did not step aside. In one calculated, swift movement, she slammed her shoulder directly into my side, just above my hip. A blinding spike of pain shot through my body. The breath exploded out of my lungs in a desperate gasp. My grip slipped on the railing, and I tumbled down the 2 remaining steps, hitting the landing hard on my tailbone, the impact jarring my entire frame. I lay there on the floor, curled around my stomach, paralyzed by shock and the sudden, overwhelming terror that I had just lost the babies. Jessica finally put the phone down, stepping over me to get to the stairs. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't call for help. "Oh, Haven," she said, her voice dripping with false concern as she looked down at my shaking body. "You have to be more careful. You're so clumsy. You know, you really should stop drinking that wine if you're going to be so unstable." She smirked, a flash of pure, wicked satisfaction, and then bounded down the stairs, leaving me to pull myself across the hardwood floor toward the landline phone. I was bleeding slightly, and the sheer panic made the room swim. I called my OB/GYN's office and then Ryan's name, yelling until my throat was raw. When Ryan finally came running, he looked panicked, but the panic was instantly replaced by a confused frown when he saw his mother, Helen, appear right behind him. "What happened here?" Helen demanded, folding her arms. Before I could speak, Jessica was back, looking innocent. "She just tripped, Mom. She gets so dizzy sometimes. She needs to rest more." Ryan rushed me to the emergency room. We spent 5 hours there, waiting for the doctors to confirm that the boys were still safe, their heartbeats strong and steady. During those agonizing hours, Ryan didn't hold my hand once. He just sat across from me in the sterile waiting room, looking at the floor. When we finally returned home, the atmosphere was poisonous. The stair incident had confirmed that the abuse was not just cruel, it was actively malicious. They were trying to hurt me, trying to hurt my children. Over the next 2 weeks, the final phase of psychological deterioration began, orchestrated solely by Helen. She started leaving articles on the kitchen counter, snippets from magazines about high-asset divorce cases, articles detailing how difficult it was for rich men to trust women who came from nothing. She didn't speak the accusations to me, but she whispered them constantly to Ryan, in corners, in the hall, behind the closed door of their new shared bedroom. I only caught fragments, but the message was clear. "She's still on that phone all the time, Ryan. Who is she talking to? Her clients? That design firm is just an excuse, son. She married you fast, didn't she? Did you ever stop to wonder why someone like her, with no job, no family, would latch onto you so quickly when she looks like that? Be smart, Ryan. Protect your assets. You don't know who she is seeing when you're at work. Those babies. Are they even yours?" I could see the poisonous suspicion taking root in Ryan's eyes. He stopped asking me about my day. He stopped touching my stomach. When I looked at him, I no longer saw the loving man I married. I saw a frightened boy who was desperate for his mother's approval. A boy who was being fed a daily diet of doubt, and who was choosing to swallow every single lie whole. He started checking my movements, waiting to see if I would sneak a phone call, watching me with cold, distant suspicion. The love was gone, replaced by calculated distrust. I was alone, isolated, 8 months pregnant with twins, and completely trapped inside a house run by people who actively wished me harm. The final, devastating betrayal was now only a matter of time. The isolation became absolute. The silence that fell over the Wallace house was thick and suffocating, interrupted only by Helen's loud, calculated criticisms or the sound of Ryan pouring another drink in the kitchen, carefully avoiding eye contact. I stopped pleading, stopped reacting to the barbed insults. I lay in the cold guest room, my belly a taut, uncomfortable drum, and stared at the water stains on the ceiling. I was no longer seeing them as a dysfunctional family. I was studying them as an enemy force. Their malice was not emotional, it was administrative. The way Helen orchestrated the grocery shopping, ensuring I only got the cheapest, most nutrient-poor food. The way Jessica timed her visits to coincide precisely with my only allowed time of rest. This was organized cruelty, designed to break me down physically and discredit me emotionally, creating a narrative of a neglectful, weak, or possibly unstable mother. The thought chilled me deeper than the damp air in the room. If they were building a case, they must have a goal bigger than just getting rid of me. They wanted the twins. That realization, a sickening lurch in my gut, snapped the last thread of the exhausted victim I had been playing. I was Catherine Monroe, and I did not survive a previous attempt on my life and build an $8 billion company just to let a provincial tyrant steal my children. I needed proof. I needed to see their strategy. The house fell quiet around 11:30 p.m. Ryan usually stayed up later, scrolling through news articles or brooding over the increasing tension, but tonight he had passed out early on the worn living room sofa. Helen and George were predictable, clockwork sleepers. The air was cold, the kind of stillness that amplified the slightest creak. Moving was agony. Each push of my body against the inertia of my heavy pregnancy was a chore, but adrenaline masked the pain. I moved slowly, silently, pushing myself up the narrow stairs toward the main bedroom, my bare feet padding on the old carpet runners. I bypassed Ryan and slipped into Helen's large, cluttered room. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old dust, a deceptively comforting scent hiding the venom that resided there. I knew Helen was obsessively organized, keeping her important papers either locked in a file cabinet in the garage or hidden in a safe in her closet. The garage was too risky. I focused on the closet. My hands shook, not from fear, but from the immense effort of balancing. I leaned against the heavy wood of the dresser, searching. It wasn't in the obvious drawers full of sweaters. It wasn't under the stack of thick blankets. Finally, behind a row of moth-eaten coats, I found a small, heavy wooden box, the kind designed to look like a relic, but meant for storage. It was secured with a cheap, tiny latch, one that only needed a steady hand and a paperclip. It took 5 minutes that felt like 5 years, listening to the strained silence of the house. My breath held tight in my chest. Click. The lid opened, revealing several thick manila folders. I pulled them out, placing them gently on the floor next to me, using the dim ambient light filtering in from the hallway to read the labels. The first was labeled Haven, Activities. B. Inside were dozens of grainy photos. Me running errands, me walking into the small office building where I sometimes pretended to meet clients, me standing outside the hospital after a prenatal checkup. Surveillance. They had been watching me since before the wedding, meticulously charting my mundane life. The second folder stopped my heart. It was labeled The Firm Connection. Inside were printouts, badly researched, but clearly indicating they had been looking for a link between Haven and corporate power. They had pulled up news articles about high-level CEO movements, particularly mentioning Catherine Monroe, the young, reclusive CEO of Apex Innovations, who had mysteriously purchased several local properties recently. Helen's scrawled notes in the margins were chilling. Too big of a profile jump. Where does she get the funds? They hadn't connected the dots fully, but they were close enough to suspect my persona was a cover for something much bigger than a freelance designer. Then, the final file. It had no label, just a rubber band around it. I peeled back the thick cardstock, and the world went cold. Blank adoption forms. 3 sets. Forms for termination of parental rights, clearly labeled and waiting for signatures, followed by forms detailing the immediate transfer of custody to a suitable, stable, and established relative, Helen Wallace. It wasn't about divorce or money, it was about erasure. They were waiting for the babies to be born, waiting for me to be weak and vulnerable, to manufacture a crisis that would allow them to claim I was an unfit mother and steal my sons. The shock was so profound it wasn't painful. It was paralyzing, immediately followed by a surge of pure, icy clarity. Catherine Monroe was awake. The softness, the vulnerability of Haven was instantly incinerated by the protective rage of a mother. I closed the box and replaced everything exactly as I found it. I moved back downstairs with newfound determination, fueled by a terrible protective energy. Back in the guest room, I found my hidden, disposable phone, the one Marcus had insisted I keep charged and concealed just in case of emergency. I sent a single coded text message to Marcus, my highly competent assistant, who was the only other person in the world who knew the true scope of my identity and resources. Code Red Phase 1 complete. Deploying assets. Marcus's response was instantaneous, efficient, and brief. Location received. ETA 0300. I spent the next 3 hours mapping the house in my mind. The blind spots, the areas where Helen spent the most time plotting, the breakfast nook, the landline near the kitchen, the corners where Ryan often retreated to brood, the small liquor cabinet in the dining room. At 3 a.m., a silent black car idled 2 blocks away. Marcus, moving with the quiet precision of a ghost, scaled the trellis outside the guest room window. I met him there. "Ma'am, you look." He trailed off, seeing the dark circles under my eyes and the sheer size of my pregnant frame, but his voice remained professional. "Don't comment. The clock is running. We have maybe 4 weeks until delivery. We need comprehensive coverage," I whispered, holding the window barely ajar. Marcus slid a small, heavy travel bag through the opening. "Everything is encrypted. Zero trace. I brought the custom units. Pinhole cameras for video. Directional microphones for localized conversations. GPS trackers. I advise placing those on their vehicles immediately. Tonight." "Done," I confirmed. "I need redundancy. They cannot find a single gap in the documentation. Start with the main living areas, then the master bedroom if possible, and definitely the kitchen table." He nodded, already gone before the last word left my lips, dissolving back into the pre-dawn darkness. The next 72 hours were torturous, a clandestine operation layered over a high-risk pregnancy. Each movement of the heavy equipment, the tiny transmitters, the hard drives, the tools for careful installation, felt monumental. I worked only when I was certain the house was asleep, moving like a shadow, often crawling on my hands and knees because standing was too painful. In the kitchen, I hid a mic inside the floral centerpiece Helen insisted on, pointing the directional receiver toward her usual seat. In the living room, a camera was nested deep inside a stack of old books on the highest shelf, giving a perfect wide shot of the sofa where Ryan sat and brooded. The most difficult was placing the audio recorder near Helen's antique landline, hidden inside a hollowed-out tissue box, ensuring it captured every call she made to Jessica or her lawyer, detailing their scheme. I even managed to secure a microphone inside the air vent of their master bathroom, knowing Helen often spoke her cruelest intentions to herself while getting ready. The house was transformed. It was no longer a home or a prison. It was a recording studio. Every whispered accusation, every slammed door, every calculated slight, every agonizing moment of my own suffering was now being captured, time-stamped, and securely beamed to an off-site server controlled by Marcus, miles away from their grasp. The pain of the pregnancy intensified, but now I welcomed it. The physical suffering was a distraction from the mental clarity I needed. I adopted the role of the frail, beaten-down wife completely. I spoke softly, ate only what I was given, and never challenged Helen or Ryan. I played the part of Haven, the helpless victim, perfectly, because the better I played the role, the more damning the evidence they would create for me. My goal narrowed to one thing: survival until delivery. I endured Ryan's cold shoulder, his suspicion now a constant, palpable force in the air between us. I endured Helen's deliberate actions, such as removing the only comfortable chair from my room and replacing it with a hard wooden one to encourage better posture. I endured Jessica's smug phone calls, loudly discussing my unfitness with Helen while I was within earshot. I was no longer trusting Ryan. I was waiting for him to make the final, catastrophic mistake that would seal his fate. Every time I felt the twins move inside me, a sharp, hopeful flutter that contrasted with the cold calculations in my mind, I reminded myself why I was suffering through this performance. I was gathering the ammunition to protect them. The Wallaces planned to steal my sons. They had built their trap, but they didn't know I had laid mine first. covering every inch of their battlefield with invisible eyes and ears, ready to record their final, fatal step. I was counting the days. Soon, the evidence would be complete, and the children would be born. And then, the true war would begin. The true war began exactly at 2 o'clock in the morning, not with a clash of steel, but with a deep, grinding ache that seized Haven low in her belly. It was nothing like the Braxton Hicks practice contractions. This was a purposeful, crushing force. She lay still in the cold guest room, hands pressed to her enormous abdomen, waiting for the feeling to recede. It did not. When the second wave hit 10 minutes later, sharper and longer, a faint cry escaped her lips. She tried to sit up, her body clumsy and heavy. Fear, cold and sharp, replaced the calculated patience she had maintained for months. This was real. The plan, meticulously laid out by Helen, required Haven to call her in the event of labor. Helen, the self-appointed matron of the house, was supposed to drive her to the hospital. Haven dragged herself out of the too-soft bed, trembling as she leaned against the damp wall. "Helen," she whispered, then louder. "Helen, it's starting." Silence. The sound of the furnace kicking on was the only answer. She stumbled to the door and pounded lightly, remembering the instructions not to wake George. "Helen, please, I need to go." After a full minute, the door to Helen's room opened. Helen stood there, a thin silk robe pulled tight around her, her face set in an expression of pure, annoyed contempt. "What is it, Haven? Are you still carrying on?" Helen's voice was a low, acidic drawl. "I'm having contractions. They're 10 minutes apart. I need to get to the hospital." Haven tried to keep the panic out of her voice, knowing that any show of weakness was ammunition. Helen folded her arms, looking Haven up and down with clinical disdain. "Oh, please. You have been faking aches and pains for 6 months now. You just want attention. Go back to bed. When the real contractions start, you won't need to knock. We'll hear you screaming." She stood there, blocking the hallway, a massive, immovable obstacle of malice. A wave of pain ripped through Haven, forcing a gasp that she couldn't stifle. She leaned against the door frame, breathing raggedly. Helen laughed, a short, cruel sound that was somehow louder and more cutting than a scream. "See? Drama. Go lie down. You are not disrupting my sleep for your theatrics." The door shut with a decisive click, plunging the hallway back into total darkness. Haven stood frozen, the reality crashing down on her. They were not just cruel, they were actively endangering the lives of her unborn children. If she waited for Helen to relent, she might lose the babies. The urgency of the crisis wiped away every remaining shred of her passive Haven persona. She crawled back into the guest room, ignoring the sharp, rough texture of the cheap carpet digging into her knees. Her legs were shaky, her back already aching. She didn't dare use her true phone yet. The cameras recorded everything. But the final, public war had not yet begun. She lunged for the small, cheap landline phone placed on the bedside table, dragging the cord closer. She dialed the emergency number, gripping the receiver with sweaty hands. "I need an ambulance," she gasped between the crushing waves. "I'm pregnant with twins, high risk, and I'm in labor. I cannot get to the hospital." She gave the suburban address in precise, clinical tones. Within minutes, the distant, eerie sound of sirens cut through the quiet night air. They grew louder, closer, shattering the illusion of peaceful sleep inside the Wallace house. Haven heard Helen's panicked whisper from the next room, then George's muffled, groggy demand for quiet. The lights of the ambulance flashed through the thin curtains. Haven, barely able to stand, braced herself against the wall as the EMTs burst through the front door, their voices loud and professional, demanding to know what was happening. Helen appeared in the doorway of the guest room, her face white with fury and shock. This was unplanned. This was uncontrolled. "She's fine. She's just being dramatic," Helen hissed at the paramedics. But the EMTs, seeing Haven's condition, her obvious distress, the deep sweat on her brow, and the visible signs of imminent labor, ignored Helen completely. They worked quickly, stabilizing her and getting her onto the stretcher, pushing past Helen's attempts to intervene. As they lifted her out, Helen leaned in, her eyes burning into Haven's. "You will pay for this public spectacle. You hear me?" But Haven was already gone, focusing only on the pain and the silent promise to her sons that she would keep them safe. The birth was hard. The twins, Ethan and Evan, were born 24 hours later, small but healthy, their tiny, perfect cries filling the sterile hospital room with the sound of triumph. Haven held them, one on each side, feeling a love so vast and terrible that it physically hurt. They were her purpose, the core around which her entire empire was built. And they had almost been taken from her. The staff kept asking about the father. Ryan had ignored the calls from the hospital. He finally arrived 2 days after the birth, stumbling into the room at visiting hours. He didn't look tired. He looked hungover. The smell of stale beer and cheap spirits clung to his shirt. He stopped at the foot of the bed, his face empty. He didn't rush to see the babies in the bassinets beside her. He looked at Haven instead, his expression a dull mixture of resentment and manufactured suspicion, the poison Helen had pumped into him for months. "You look tired," he slurred. It was not a question or a statement of concern, merely a neutral observation. "I just gave birth to your 2 sons, Ryan. We waited 2 days for you to show up." He shrugged, walking over to the nearest bassinet and glancing down at Evan. He didn't reach out. He didn't smile. "Mom said you caused a huge scene," he mumbled, his focus already drifting away. "The neighbors saw the ambulance. You made us look foolish." Haven felt a cold dread settle deep in her bones. She watched him move back from the babies, avoiding interaction. He was not indifferent to her. He was indifferent to them. Helen's narrative, that these were not his children, that Haven was a calculating liar, had completely overwritten the reality of his own flesh and blood. He stayed less than 15 minutes, discussing only how soon she could come home to resume her duties. "Mom says the house is a mess," he said finally, turning to leave. "Try not to be too much trouble when we get you back." As he walked out, not even looking back at the 2 small beings who shared his name, Haven understood fully. Ryan Wallace was gone. He had chosen the lie. The return to the Wallace house was the 10th circle of hell. With 2 newborns, the cold guest room became a logistical nightmare. Every cry, every changing, every feeding felt amplified under Helen's constant silent surveillance. The pressure intensified instantly. Helen would vacuum outside the door at 6 a.m. Jessica would walk past Haven's room multiple times, slamming doors. Ryan was never around, always busy or working late, avoiding the sight of the children entirely. Haven was running on fumes, feeding, changing, and attempting to pump milk for the twins' vital early nutrition. Her body was still healing. She was physically depleted. On the 10th day after the twins' birth, a wave of exhaustion hit her so hard she couldn't stand up. She knew she had to pump to maintain her supply. She finished the session, carefully labeling the large bottle of liquid gold, a full 8 ounces that represented hours of physical exertion and stress, and placed it gently in the small refrigerator she had purchased for the guest room, knowing she needed a 5-minute break before attempting the complex task of sterilizing the equipment. When she finally stood up, stiff and aching, she heard the kitchen door swing open and the sound of running water. The kitchen was just across the hall. Haven pulled on her thin robe and walked out, intending to wash the pumping tools, but she stopped dead in the doorway. Helen Wallace was standing at the stainless steel sink. In her hand, she held the bottle of breast milk. The lid was off. A thick, opaque stream of the precious white liquid was running down the drain, churning and frothing as it mixed with the wastewater. It made a sickening, sloshing sound against the porcelain. "What are you doing?" Haven whispered. The sound of her own voice felt thin and fragile. Helen did not startle. She did not even turn around. She was looking down at the rushing drain with quiet satisfaction, slowly tipping the bottle until the last drop of milk was gone. She rinsed the empty plastic container under the tap, then finally turned to face Haven, a pleasant, almost bored expression on her face. "Oh, hello, Haven," Helen said. "Just cleaning up?" "That was the milk. That was the twins' food." "Why did you do that?" Haven felt a dizzying wave of disbelief, then blinding rage. This was no longer just about psychological cruelty. This was about deliberately harming the newborns. Helen adjusted the collar of her cardigan. "It was spoiling, dear. You leave things in there too long. Besides," she gave a sharp, unpleasant smirk, "they don't need that much. They're already big boys. You need to stop being so indulgent. If you don't conserve your energy, you'll never be able to keep up with the chores. You don't deserve that resource if you can't even keep the room tidy." The message was clear. I control your suffering, and I control your children's basic needs. Helen had crossed a definitive line, moving from psychological warfare to physical destruction of resources essential for survival. Haven said nothing. She simply stared, her face tight, her eyes burning holes through Helen. She saw not a mother-in-law, but a monster. She turned and walked back into the guest room, the sound of the wasted milk echoing in her ears. That evening, Haven was too tired to move. She sat in the rocking chair, dimly lit by the small lamp, watching her two sons sleep, their chests rising and falling in perfect unison. She was completely broken, physically and mentally. Suddenly, she heard Helen's voice from the kitchen, clearer than usual. The door was slightly ajar, and the cameras were picking up the sound perfectly. Helen was on the phone, her voice lowered, conspiratorial. "Yes, Jessica. It is almost ready. She's too weak to fight now. I saw it in her eyes today. It's time." A pause. A nervous chuckle from Helen. "Don't worry about Ryan. He is completely convinced. He just wants the problem gone. Tonight or tomorrow night, we move." Another pause. "Yes. Tell George to be ready with the papers. We need to be fast. We execute Phase 2 the minute she falls asleep. The police will take our word over hers. We have the motive, the evidence, and the documentation. Once the babies are out, she's finished." The line clicked dead. Haven sat motionless in the dark. Phase 2. They weren't waiting for the divorce. They were moving to snatch the children under cover of darkness, backed by the lies and manufactured evidence Helen had prepared for months. They planned to strike within hours, taking advantage of her exhaustion, relying on the false narrative of the adulterous, unfit mother. She looked down at Ethan, then at Evan. Their soft, innocent faces were everything. She had suffered through the pregnancy, the betrayal, the abuse, enduring the cold, the ridicule, and the physical threat of the lost milk, all for this moment. She had gathered every piece of evidence. The true war was not going to wait until she was ready, rested, or legally prepared. It was starting now. Haven reached under the bassinet, her hand shaking slightly as she pulled out the sleek, military-grade smartphone hidden there. It was the phone of Catherine Monroe, CEO of Apex Innovations, the device that contained the keys to their destruction. She would not wait for them to finish their plotting. She would not wait for Phase 2. The Wallaces were coming for the twins, and Catherine Monroe was going to meet them at the door. She set the phone down, her gaze fixed on the door. All she had to do now was wait for the final, catastrophic moment of their betrayal. It would be the last mistake any of them ever made. The silence of the house had always been a tense thing. a fragile skin stretched thin over cruelty. But at midnight on the 10th night after the twins' birth, that skin tore. The door to the guest room, the damp room they had forced her into, did not knock. It exploded inward with the sound of a heavy shoulder hitting old wood. The light snapped on above her, harsh and white, tearing into the darkness and searing her eyes. Haven threw an arm up, shielding her vision, instantly panicked for the two tiny figures sleeping soundly beside her in the double bassinet. Standing in the doorway, blocking the exit, were four faces arranged in a triumphant, monstrous tableau. George stood stoically behind Helen, his expression blank. Jessica was grinning, clutching a stack of papers. And Ryan stood closest, rigid, his shoulders high, his face utterly unrecognizable. "Get up, Haven," Ryan said. His voice was flat, hollow. It held no anger, no sadness, just the cold, dead delivery of an instruction. Haven pushed herself upright in the bed, the healing incision protesting with a deep, throbbing ache. She pulled the thin sheet protectively over her chest, the only barrier between her and the onslaught. "What is going on?" Jessica stepped forward, dropping a stack of blurry, printed-out photos onto the bedspread. The images were cheap, badly edited, and instantly recognizable as nonsense. A dark car outside a city building. A shadowy figure leaving a restaurant. Each photo attempted to place Haven, the freelance designer, in a high-class compromising setting, sometimes with a figure whose face was conveniently obscured. "Don't pretend you don't know," Jessica sneered, her eyes glittering with sick satisfaction. "We've known all along, you cheap little gold digger. You thought we wouldn't find out you were still screwing around while Ryan worked his ass off?" Haven ignored Jessica, looking only at Ryan. He did not meet her gaze. He stared past her head, fixed on some internal, predetermined script. "Ryan, these are fake. You know I haven't left this room except for the hospital," Haven pleaded, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "This is Helen. This is all her doing. Look at me, please." Helen pushed past both her children, her face contorted into a mask of righteous fury. "Don't you dare try to manipulate my son again, you lying tramp." Her voice was shrill, cutting through the small room. She raised a shaking finger and pointed at the bassinet where Ethan and Evan slept, completely oblivious. Those things are not his. I knew it the moment you walked in the door. You brought bastards into my house to try and trap my son. We won't have it." The word bastards struck Haven harder than any physical blow. The sudden, terrible clarity hit her. They weren't just trying to shame her. They were moving to take the children. This was it. Phase 2. Haven's eyes darted from the babies to Helen's enraged face. Before Haven could form a response, Helen lunged the last foot and spat. The saliva was warm, hitting Haven hard on the cheek, running slowly down her skin. It was pure physical contempt, a final punctuation mark on months of psychological torment. Haven stopped breathing. The rage that boiled up inside her was so immense it was terrifying. For a split second, Haven Monroe wanted to smash the woman's head through the drywall. But she was weak, recovering, and vastly outnumbered. She had a greater purpose. Ryan finally looked down, his eyes glazed. "We need a DNA test," he stated, the words clipped. "Right now. The lawyers are waiting. You will sign the custody papers, and we will take them to ensure their security." "No," Haven whispered, shaking her head. "No, you don't get them. They are mine." "You have no choice," Ryan said, his voice rising in volume but not in emotion. He grabbed Haven's arm, his grip surprisingly strong and rough. He started dragging her toward the door. "You are leaving. The boys are staying here until this is sorted out. Now, move." The action erased the last shadow of the man she thought she had married. He was not weak. He was complicit. He was not silent. He was actively discarding her. The terror of losing the twins was absolute. It overrode the pain of her incision, the ache in her bones, and the raw fear of the cold. Instinct took over. As Ryan pulled her arm, Haven yanked it back and dove for the bassinet. She scooped up the first twin, Ethan, tucking his tiny, sleeping body under her left arm. She lunged for the second, Evan, wrapping her right arm around him, just as Ryan gripped her shoulder again. "Let them go!" Ryan roared, now fully aggressive. "No! Don't touch them!" Haven screamed, planting her feet. George stepped forward to assist Ryan. Haven staggered under the sudden dual pressure, the pain in her abdomen spiking violently. She felt the sickening warmth of fresh blood soaking into her thin pajama bottoms. "Get her out, George!" Helen shrieked, pressing close, nearly foaming with excitement. "Just get her out! The kids stay here!" Ryan used his full weight, shoving Haven backward. She stumbled, clutching the two bundles tightly to her chest, twisting her body so she took the force of the shove and the impact against the wall. Not the babies. George grabbed her other arm and pulled, leveraging her toward the hallway. They wrestled her through the doorway, down the short hall, and toward the main living area. Haven fought only to shield the children. She twisted, kicked out weakly, and tried to shout, but her lungs were already burning with the effort. The front door, heavy oak, was suddenly there. Ryan held the door open, his face set in a mask of final, cold rejection. George pushed her from behind, a powerful, determined shove. Haven tumbled over the threshold, tripping on the top step, crashing onto the small, freezing concrete porch. The cold hit her like a physical wave. It was November midnight. The air was wet and sharp, tasting of ice. She wore nothing but thin cotton pajamas, already saturated with sweat and blood. Haven scrabbled on the rough concrete, the pain searing from her hip up through her torso. She checked the twins instantly. Both were fine, still asleep, bundled safely inside the crook of her arms. She looked up, desperate, as Ryan stood framed in the light of the doorway. He looked down at her, the mother of his children, bleeding and half-dressed in the freezing night, holding their newborn sons. "Stay out," Ryan said, his voice hard and utterly final, "until we get the results. If you try to come back, we will call the police and say you assaulted us." Then, without another word, Ryan Wallace slammed the door. The sound of the heavy oak meeting the frame was deafening, final, and absolute. The vibration rattled through the concrete and into Haven's shaking body. The single, sharp click of the deadbolt locking into place severed the last connection she had to that house, that life, and that pathetic lie she had been living. The interior light vanished, replaced by the profound, indifferent cold of the suburban night. Haven lay there for a long moment, huddled on the cold, dirty step, the babies pressed against her chest, their warmth the only thing tethering her to reality. The cold seeped through the thin fabric of her pajamas, chilling the sweat on her skin, making the blood feel like ice. She looked at the imposing, dark structure of the Wallace house, the house of supposed love, which had become a torture chamber. In that freezing, silent moment, the flimsy, gentle identity of Haven, the freelance designer seeking simple honesty, shattered like cheap glass. It dissolved into the frost. What rose in its place was the hard, cold, unyielding reality of Catherine Monroe, the CEO, the survivor, the woman who built an $8 billion empire, brick by traumatic brick. Haven was weak, but Catherine was ruthless. Catherine Monroe carefully shifted her weight, ignoring the sharp, tearing agony in her incision, and pushed herself to her knees. She felt the concrete biting into the thin skin of her legs. The cold burned her lungs with every ragged breath. She looked at the boys. Ethan stirred slightly, snuffling, but remained asleep. Evan let out a small, wet sigh. They were safe. That was all that mattered. Catherine reached into the single deep pocket of her pajama top. Months ago, she had sewn that pocket herself, making sure it was hidden, secure, and always accessible, storing the one object that tied her to her true power. Her fingers closed around the smooth, heavy metal of her real phone, the high-security, untraceable private line that only 2 people on the planet had the number for. She pulled it out. The screen lit up in the oppressive dark, illuminating her face. Her eyes, usually softened by the facade of Haven, were now sharp, clear, and terrifyingly analytical. There was no grief, no fear left, only strategy. She knew Marcus was awake. Marcus was always awake. The phone connected instantly. "Marcus," she said. Her voice was steady, low, and cut through the frozen air like a razor blade. It was the voice of a CEO ordering a hostile takeover, not a traumatized mother crying for help. "Catherine," Marcus responded, his voice immediately tense, recognizing the emergency in the simple use of her full name. "What is your status? Are you safe?" "I am outside the house," she stated, looking back at the locked front door. "They completed phase 2. They just threw me out. The twins are with me. They are unharmed." She adjusted the babies, pulling them tighter to her breast, feeling the faint, sticky wetness of the blood against her skin. "Send the vehicle immediately," she commanded. "The penthouse. Notify Linda. I want the war room fully staffed in 1 hour. All files on George Wallace's business contracts, Ryan's employment history, and Helen's personal finances must be ready and projected on the screens." She paused, taking a slow, deep breath, tasting the cold metallic air. The time for surveillance, waiting, and enduring was over. She had every piece of evidence she needed. "It's time," Catherine Monroe said, the finality of the statement echoing the loud slam of the door. "I'm ready. We burn them down." The vehicle was silent, obsidian black, gliding through the cold city streets. Catherine sat bolted upright in the leather seat, the heat blasting, but she felt only the residual deep, aching cold of the November pavement pressed against her bare feet hours ago. She held the twins, Ethan settled against her shoulder, Evan stirring lightly in the crook of her arm. Marcus, sitting opposite, did not speak, sensing the razor edge of her focus. He simply handed her a thick, white cashmere blanket and a bottle of warmed formula, his movements precise and silent. When they arrived at the penthouse, a private elevator whisked them directly into the secure residence level. This was not the suburban house of lies. This was the center of her $8 billion universe. Marcus took the babies immediately, handing them off to the rotation of specialized nurses who had been waiting for the emergency call. Catherine walked past the immense windows that framed the city skyline, millions of lights, all running on systems she had engineered, fueled by money she had built. She moved into the custom-designed dressing room. 10 minutes later, the thin, stained cotton pajamas were gone. In their place was a dark gray suit, tailored flawlessly, the fabric heavy and structured, a literal armor. Her hair, previously tied back carelessly, was brushed into a severe, sharp line. Haven, the timid freelance designer, was fully erased. Catherine Monroe, the CEO, looked into the mirror. Her face was pale, drawn from exhaustion and recent childbirth, but her eyes held a crystalline, dangerous clarity. There was no more pain, only intent. She entered the adjoining room, the war room. The atmosphere inside was quiet, almost surgical. The room was circular, dominated by 5 massive holographic screens that projected live data feeds and complex corporate structures. Linda, Catherine's lead attorney, sat at the central table, radiating competence. She was a woman who saw legal battles as blood sports and was famous for never losing. Marcus stood by the main control panel, ready. A small team of forensic accountants and corporate investigators occupied the back stations, already immersed in data. They had been told only the basics. A hostile takeover was necessary, immediate, and required total discretion. Catherine did not sit. She approached the central screen, which immediately displayed a complex organizational chart of the Wallace family's entire financial network, color-coded for vulnerability. "Linda, Marcus," Catherine said, her voice low and steady, stripped of any warmth. "Thank you for coming. We are past the planning stage." She signaled Marcus. The screens immediately shifted from financial data to surveillance footage. The air in the war room became ice-cold as the first clip began to play. It was the video from the kitchen camera, captured 10 days earlier. Helen Wallace stood at the sink, smirking, pouring a full bottle of Catherine's pumped breast milk directly down the drain. The sound, the light gurgle of the milk disappearing, filled the powerful speakers. The next clip showed George Wallace passively watching the stairs as Jessica deliberately hip-checked Haven, then heavily pregnant, causing her to stagger and fall against the railing. The final clip was the midnight scene from the previous hour. Ryan's cold, dead eyes, the shove, Helen's face spitting fury, the sound of the front door slamming on the sound of the freezing wind, leaving Catherine and the babies on the steps. Catherine let the sound decay into silence. She looked at her team. Linda had not moved, but her jaw was tight. Marcus looked away, a flicker of genuine shock crossing his features, despite having known the scale of the abuse. "This evidence is airtight," Catherine stated. "Physical abuse, attempted criminal harm, emotional cruelty, and parental kidnapping attempt. They created a narrative that I was incompetent and dangerous, all to steal my sons." She brought her attention back to the organizational charts. "The game changes now. We are not seeking justice. We are seeking utter, irreversible destruction. I want their reputation ruined, their finances zeroed out, and their names made synonymous with cruelty." Linda shifted forward. "Catherine, we have the material for a devastating restraining order and immediate custody transfer. Criminal charges for assault are easy, but financial destruction will take time. They will fight back in the press." Catherine shook her head slowly. "They will not have time to fight back. We will hit them simultaneously, financially, professionally, and then publicly. Marcus, initiate Phase Alpha." Marcus nodded. "Beginning immediate execution of all pre-vetted corporate maneuvers." "Old Ryan Wallace is employed as a middle manager at Henderson Tech," Catherine continued, detailing the attack plan with chilling clarity. "Apex Innovations purchased a controlling interest in Henderson Tech 3 hours ago, under the shell company, Aurora Holdings. Terminate Ryan Wallace immediately. Effective 5 a.m. local time. No severance. Cause: gross corporate negligence and moral turpitude, based on the documented evidence of his actions. Make sure his exit interview is scheduled for 8 a.m., so he reports to an office he no longer holds access to." Marcus typed swiftly. The confirmation signal flashed green. The call had been placed. Ryan's career was incinerated while he slept off his drunken celebration of expelling his wife. "Next," Catherine pressed, focusing on the screen displaying George Wallace's company. George's construction company, Wallace & Sons, is currently dependent on a substantial working capital loan from Metropolitan Bank. We acquired that loan discreetly last week. Linda, call the loan in full immediately. The due date is now." Linda's eyes narrowed in professional admiration. "A capital call of that size is instant bankruptcy for George. He'll be insolvent before lunch." "That is the objective," Catherine confirmed. Finally, Jessica Wallace. Her boutique, Coastal Chic. Bis. She rents the prime retail space on Market Street. Marcus already had the file open. "The building is owned by your property group, CityLink Ventures. Deliver the eviction notice at 6 a.m. sharp," Catherine ordered. 3 days to vacate, lease termination due to undisclosed structural issues and immediate need for remediation. Make it public record that she failed to meet sanitation standards. Ruin the store's name while you ruin the lease. The war room staff worked in silence for the next hour. A symphony of targeted corporate warfare. Catherine watched the execution, her face devoid of emotion. She was witnessing the instantaneous dismantling of the 4 pillars that held up the Wallaces' lives: stability, money, ego, and status. By dawn, Ryan would be unemployed. George would be facing financial ruin. Jessica would be packing boxes. And Helen, the orchestrator, would find her world of supposed respectable status crumbling around her. "The first round is complete," Catherine announced, looking at the timestamp, 4:30 a.m. "Now, we prepare the public stage. We have 48 hours to compile the final package." Linda had already outlined the media strategy. "We need maximum impact. We cannot be seen as just a scorned ex-wife. We need to be the victim fighting back against institutional domestic terrorism." "I am not the victim," Catherine corrected sharply. "I am the target who survived. And I will use my real name, my real company, and my real power. We reveal everything." The next 2 days passed in a focused blur of legal maneuvering, crisis management, and media preparation. Catherine maintained a disciplined routine, feeding the twins, consulting with the legal team, and reviewing the evidence tape, ensuring the narrative was perfectly controlled. She did not sleep for more than 3 hours total. She was running on pure adrenaline and the cold, unshakable fuel of justified vengeance. 48 hours later, the Wallaces were reeling. George had tried to call Apex Innovations for a desperate contract bailout, only to be redirected to the holding company that owned his debt. Ryan had spent a humiliating morning trying to beg his way back into an office he no longer had access to, eventually being handed a termination notice that cited his failure to support his wife during a high-risk pregnancy as one of the morality clauses breached. Jessica was hysterically arguing with movers about the legality of the immediate eviction, but the final blow was yet to land. At precisely 11 a.m., Catherine Monroe walked onto the stage of the City Convention Center ballroom. The room was jammed, humming with the energy of hundreds of international media outlets. She had called a press conference on corporate transparency and ethical oversight, promising a major announcement regarding Apex Innovations. No one expected this. Catherine stood behind a massive lectern, flanked by Linda and Marcus. She wore the same sharp gray suit. The bright lights illuminated her exhaustion, making her look both fragile and incredibly fierce. She started calmly, discussing the importance of personal integrity in leadership. Then she paused, looking directly into the primary camera lens. 2 years ago, she began, her voice steady and projecting clearly across the vast room, I created an alternate identity. I did this because I needed to know if I could be loved for myself, separate from the wealth and power that defined Catherine Monroe, CEO of Apex Innovations. A wave of shocked whispering immediately swept the room. Journalists frantically checked their notes. I named this persona Haven, she continued, holding up a framed photo of herself, smiling shyly from the time she met Ryan. I met Ryan Wallace. I married him. And 9 months ago, I became pregnant with twins. She detailed the high-risk pregnancy and the Wallaces' move into her home under the guise of help. The room went silent, gripped by the intimacy of the corporate titan exposing her deepest secret. What I found was not a loving family, Catherine said, her voice dropping, but a calculated, premeditated attack designed to remove me and steal my children, based on their contempt for what they believed was my low social status. She signaled Marcus. The massive screens behind her, usually reserved for quarterly earnings reports, lit up with the footage captured by the hidden cameras. The sound system was crisp, The journalists watched in stunned silence as the clips, edited perfectly for maximum emotional damage, played one after another. They saw Helen Wallace, the matriarch who taught Sunday school, laughing while Haven screamed in pain during early labor, accusing her of faking it. They saw Jessica's violent bump on the stairs. They saw Ryan's cold indifference 2 days after the birth. Then came the final, brutal footage of the forced expulsion. The cameras showed Ryan pushing the fragile, bleeding woman in thin pajamas out the door, twins clutched desperately in her arms, the sound of the lock clicking, sealing the fate of the Wallace family. When the footage faded back to black, the ballroom was absolutely silent, save for the furious clatter of keyboards. Catherine waited, letting the horror sink in. "The people you just saw," she stated, "Helen, George, Jessica, and Ryan Wallace, will face immediate criminal charges for battery, domestic violence, and reckless endangerment. They are, as of today, global pariahs." She leaned into the microphone, her final words aimed not at the room, but straight through the camera, a chilling promise delivered directly to the Wallace family, wherever they were watching. "I want every resource I have, legal, financial, and technological, focused on one objective: ensuring these people have absolutely nothing left, personally or professionally, forever." The speed of Catherine Monroe's response was not merely fast, it was instantaneously punishing, like being caught in the vacuum of space. She had spent the last 2 months gathering the material for a legal nuclear device, and now she detonated it across every aspect of the Wallaces' lives. The Wallaces did not receive polite letters or formal requests. They received total destruction delivered by high-powered professionals. Ryan was served his divorce papers at the door of his parents' house, the documents thicker than any book he owned. The process server was flanked by 2 large security guards, ensuring Ryan took the papers and signed acknowledgement. The ironclad zero-asset prenup ensured he walked away with nothing but the clothes on his back. His crippling share of the child support calculated using Catherine Monroe's actual net worth, a sum so astronomical it guaranteed he would work until he died, just to stay current. Simultaneously, the first wave of criminal charges for domestic violence, battery, and child endangerment were filed. Because the evidence was captured on crystal-clear video and audio, Helen spitting, Jessica pushing, Ryan throwing Catherine out while she bled, the police took the matter seriously. The Wallaces were suddenly being called in for questioning, fingerprinted, and released on massive bonds, their suburban anonymity shredded. The dismantling of George and Helen's shaky foundation began swiftly. The investigators Catherine had hired, the best in the world, the kind who operated without pity, did not stop at the recent abuse. They dug into the decades of lies. What they found concerning Helen Wallace was not just moral depravity, but financial crime. George's business, which relied entirely on contracts covertly managed by Apex subsidiaries, was already dead. But his personal finances were equally devastated. The private investigators revealed Helen's careful, years-long operation of embezzlement. She had been skimming profits from George's company accounts, running shadow books, and funneling money into offshore accounts for her private use, planning her own escape route should George ever fail to provide the standard of living she demanded. When the state police and the IRS arrived at the Wallace house with warrants, George finally understood the extent of his ruin. The quiet, cold, passive father discovered he had been bankrolled, mocked, and actively robbed by his own wife for 20 years. George, dependent and weak, crumbled not under Catherine's attack, but under Helen's betrayal. Within 3 days of the press conference, the same high-powered attorney who served Ryan the divorce papers served Helen with papers from George. The man who stood silently by as his daughter-in-law was abused chose his side the moment the money stopped flowing. He filed for divorce, charging Helen with fraud and theft. Helen Wallace, the chief moralist, was now isolated, facing felony charges from her own husband and the state. Catherine did not forget the final moral hypocrisy. She knew that Helen valued status and public reputation above all else. Her ultimate aim was not just financial destruction, but the total annihilation of Helen's perceived authority. Helen's arraignment for embezzlement and abuse was scheduled for a bleak Thursday morning. The courthouse was a swarm of cameras and reporters, a chaotic media frenzy arranged by Catherine's PR team. Helen was escorted in, looking pale, tired, and wearing clothes that seemed dull and cheap under the blinding camera flashes. She had lost weight, and her face was slack with terror. The prosecution read the long list of charges, detailing the domestic abuse caught on tape. Helen stood stiffly next to a desperate lawyer, trying to project a dignity that had long vanished. She was a woman who had tried to play God, and now she was facing a judge who viewed her as common criminal. Then, the final, planned disruption occurred. The courtroom doors opened slowly. A young woman, dressed in a simple, practical coat, walked in. She had quiet confidence and carried a small, worn photograph. The reporters, sensing a new angle, turned their cameras toward her. This was Sophie. Catherine's investigators had found Helen's long-abandoned biological daughter, the child Helen had discarded years ago, pretending she never existed to maintain her perfect, wealthy suburban facade. Sophie stood in the gallery aisle, waiting until the noise died down, until every eye in the room was fixed on her. She locked eyes with Helen, who visibly shuddered, her mouth falling open in a silent scream of recognition and horror. Helen had not thought about Sophie in 2 decades. "Helen Wallace," Sophie said, her voice clear and carrying across the stunned room. "You stand here accused of abandoning and abusing innocent children. You called yourself a devoted mother and a respected woman." Sophie held up the photograph, a faded image of herself as a small child. "But you are neither. You left me in foster care because I wasn't good enough for your perfect life. You preach morality, but you are rotten to the core." The sound of reporters shouting questions and the flashbulbs exploding was deafening. Helen Wallace covered her face with her hands and began to sob uncontrollably, a raw, ugly sound that destroyed the last fragments of her composure. She was not crying for the pain she caused. She was crying because her deepest, darkest secret had been yanked into the unforgiving light of day, destroying the last sliver of the respectable lie she had constructed. The Wallaces were destitute, criminally charged, and globally infamous. Jessica had been fired and evicted, now living off the kindness of increasingly annoyed relatives. Ryan was unemployed, perpetually drunk, and facing a financial future that was mathematically impossible. George was focused only on saving his retirement from Helen's theft. 2 weeks after the arraignment, Catherine Monroe called them to her office. It was not a meeting of reconciliation. It was a performance of total dominance. The Wallaces were granted an appointment at 5 p.m. They were processed by 3 layers of security before being led into Catherine's penthouse war room. The office was located 60 floors above the city, a cathedral of glass and steel. Catherine sat behind a massive desk carved from a single piece of dark stone, the setting sun turning the clouds outside her window into hues of fire and cold steel. Ryan, George, Helen, and Jessica shuffled in, looking small, defeated, and smelling faintly of stale sweat and desperation. They wore the same clothes they'd been photographed in days before, their faces etched with the exhaustion of defeat. They stood before her desk, humbled. "Catherine, please," Ryan started, his voice a choked whisper, utterly devoid of the arrogance he once possessed. We made a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. We can fix this. Just tell us what you need. I'll take any job. I'll work for free." Helen stepped forward, the tears having dried into hard, angry lines on her face. Haven, darling. Catherine. Look, we all said things we didn't mean. Family is important. We can move past this. Think of the boys. They need a grandmother. Catherine did not flinch. She observed them as if they were specimens under glass. She leaned back in her chair, her body language radiating total control. You are here for one reason only. Catherine's voice was low, clear, and perfectly flat. To understand the consequences of your choices. Jessica, tears welling up, pointed at Ryan. It's Ryan's fault. He should have controlled his mother. We didn't know she was this bad. Quiet, Catherine commanded. Jessica immediately snapped her mouth shut. Catherine picked up a slender file folder from her desk. Ryan, she said, focusing on her ex-husband, who was barely standing. You clung to the lie that I was a cheat, that my sons were not yours. You used that fake narrative as an excuse to throw your wife and children into a freezing street. Ryan nodded miserably. But the DNA test. If we just get the test. Catherine. Oh, we got the test. Catherine interrupted, her eyes cold as ice. She tapped the file. It was concluded the day you were served the divorce papers. Marcus. Marcus, standing silently by the door, nodded and read a line from the documents without expression. The paternity of both Ethan Monroe and Evan Monroe is confirmed. 100%. Ryan Wallace is the biological father. The heir left the room. Ryan's face registered a moment of dawning horror so profound it seemed to physically pain him. He stared at Catherine, comprehending the catastrophic scale of his choice. He had abandoned his own blood, his only sons, for a lie orchestrated by the very mother who had simultaneously been stealing from his father. They were yours, Catherine confirmed. The statement not a comfort, but an execution. You chose a narrative over reality. You chose hatred over love. You chose your mother's comfort over the safety of your newborn sons. You threw your children out. The Wallaces looked utterly destroyed. Helen began to whisper denials, but no one listened. We just need a chance, George pleaded, finally speaking up, his voice gravelly. Please, Catherine, I can help you. I know how things work. Don't let Helen's mistake ruin us all. Catherine put the file down. There is no chance. There is no negotiation. There is only the justice you deserve. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across each of them. The abusive mother, the treacherous sister, the passive father, and the weak husband. I am not Haven anymore. I am Catherine Monroe. And Catherine Monroe finishes what she starts. She stood up, signifying the meeting was over. She did not raise her voice. Marcus, she said. Yes, Ms. Monroe. Escort the garbage out. Marcus and the security team moved immediately. The Wallaces were too broken to resist. They were physically ushered out, down the 60 floors, and ejected onto the busy city street, completely alone and utterly ruined. The next year was a period of calculated peace built on the ruins of the Wallace family. The divorce was finalized quickly. Ryan attempted to argue against the crippling child support, but Linda, Catherine's shark attorney, used the documented videos of his abuse and abandonment to ensure he lost every motion. He was now a permanently disgraced, financially depleted man working minimum-wage jobs just to avoid contempt of court. Helen was convicted of embezzlement and domestic battery, facing serious time. George, divorced and financially compromised, faded into obscurity. Jessica faced long-term psychiatric treatment to deal with her public disgrace and the criminal conviction. The Wallaces ceased to exist as an influential family. They were merely cautionary tales. Catherine Monroe thrived. She moved her family, Ethan and Evan, into a secure, beautiful estate far from the city noise, filling their world with stability, love, and light. The twins flourished, growing into healthy, energetic boys. Catherine remained the CEO of Apex Innovations. Her public image transformed from ruthless tech mogul to symbol of strength for abused women. She had achieved every legal and personal objective. But Catherine knew that true freedom meant turning the pain into purpose. 1 year after crawling out of the Wallace house in her thin pajamas, Catherine founded the Haven Foundation for Abused Mothers. It was a massive, fully funded organization that used Apex's technology and Catherine's vast wealth to provide legal aid, secure housing, and psychological support for women escaping dangerous situations, mirroring the help Catherine had needed but never received as Haven. Turkin, sitting in her spacious, sunlit office, far from the cold darkness of the Wallace house, Catherine Monroe watched her sons play quietly with their toys on a thick rug. She felt no lingering anger, only profound peace. The trauma had nearly destroyed her, but surviving it had given her an unparalleled strength and an unshakable purpose. She was no longer running from a predator. She was running an empire, built not on revenge, but on the certainty that she would always protect those who were helpless. Now, we want to know what you thought. From 0 to 10, what score does this story deserve?